President Felix Tshisekedi of the Democratic Republic of Congo and his Rwandan counterpart, Paul Kagame, have jointly called for a ceasefire in eastern Congo. Now, in talks mediated by Qatar, the two leaders held their first face-to-face meeting since the Rwanda-backed M23 rebels scaled up their offensive in January. The conflict has heightened hostilities between the DRC and Rwanda. Both presidents have agreed to hold further talks aimed at ending the fighting, which has killed thousands of people and displaced millions. So the stakes could not be higher. Let's get across to Nicodemus Minde for more. He is a researcher with the Institute for Security Studies in Nairobi. First of all, what do you think has prompted these surprise ceasefire talks in Qatar, of all places?
Well, it was rather a very surprising turn of events. Of course, early in the day, the peace processes had already begun in Angola, in Rwanda, Angola, where representatives of both Rwanda and, of course, DRC were meeting. And then came the evening photos where we see Qatar meeting, the Emir of Qatar meeting with both the president of Rwanda and the president of Tshisekedi in a rather surprise turn of events. And there are a number of factors that could have led to this, including the pressures from sanctions that Rwanda has been sanctioned, especially from the European Union, which may have forced or may have yielded some form of pressure towards them meeting and discussing on the modalities of resolving the conflict.
Okay, so perhaps those EU sanctions against Rwanda creating pressure. I'm curious exactly why you think Qatar has made some progress here where others have failed to get to the root causes of this intractable problem.
Actually, it's one of the great mysteries. But again, if you look at Qatar, as of course over the years been able to really showcase itself as an arbiter, regional arbiter or conflict resolution country in which many of these conflicts, regional conflicts, international conflicts, have been resolved using the mediation of Qatar. So this really now falls into the continuous efforts by Qatar. But again, it is also a direct indictment to the African Union and other regional mechanisms or regional mechanisms such as that have been actually trying to really resolve the conflict between the two. So the sign of Qatar hosting these two adversaries is quite symbolic in the nature, in the sense that it brings together these two individuals who have not met in a long time and who have been throwing a lot of jabs against each other. So it's actually a good positive step, and Qatar should take a lot of credit in bringing these two leaders together.
And let's just take a look at exactly what has happened here. We've got both calling for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire. How far do we actually have to go from here to get a ceasefire in place?
As I've mentioned, there's been already ongoing mediation efforts at regional level. There's the East African Community peace efforts that have joined forces together with the South African Development Community, SADC, in joint mediation efforts in order to resolve the crisis that has been ongoing since M23 been able to take a number of towns and cities in Eastern DRC. So there's already an ongoing regional mediation mechanism that brings together the East African Community on one hand and SADC. So, and all these two regional mechanisms, or these regional economic communities, have resolved to, among other things, for a ceasefire agreement and, of course, a cessation of hostilities. So this symbolic act of the two leaders meeting would actually be a positive step towards building mutual trust in order to now take the step forward in terms of M23 either withdrawing or other, having more dialogue and a mechanism through which they can be able to discuss the modalities of ending this conflict, which has been lacking before this particular meeting that we saw yesterday.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today. That is Nicodemus Minde, a researcher with the Institute for Security Studies.
And we can get more on this from Christian-Geraud Neema from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Christian, thank you so much for joining us. Can you tell us what it was that brought about these surprise ceasefire talks in Qatar?
It was quite a surprise for all of us who've been following the situation on the ground, because for so long we know that President Tshisekedi had harsh words against President Paul Kagame, and there was no sign that the both parties were going ever to meet under the current circumstances. So the reporting from yesterday really came as a good news for many, because it was a first step to see the both presidents meeting and talking, and maybe recreating conditions for further talks that can really bring peace and stability in the region. But that was quite a surprise that Qatar has managed to take the both parties together and have a face-to-face, which many have failed so far.
Absolutely. I mean, it's the very complicated nature of this conflict makes it very difficult, doesn't it? So how do you think mediators in Qatar have managed to move things forward to this extent?
So far, it will be quite difficult to see Qatar as mediator. We can see that Qatar has good relationship with both President Tshisekedi and President Paul Kagame. We know that Qatar is about to open an embassy in the DRC in the coming weeks, and Qatar also has really further investment with Rwanda, really good relationship with Rwanda. So Qatar is very invested to have both parties sitting. We also know that for quite some time, the Emir of Qatar has been trying to get President Tshisekedi to meet President Kagame, but there was a certain sense of distrust based on the fact that they wanted an African solution to African problems. So having Emir of Qatar, given the relationship that he has with both parties, having them sitting on a table to talk, at least to get in agreement to the need of further talking, it was a good news. It was a good news for all parties involved. So we're going to have to see now if Qatar is going to become a formal mediator to this conflict. This move may be frustrating to many countries in the region, given that Angola has been playing the forefront role into mediating this conflict. So we're going to have to see what's going to happen and how Qatar is going to handle the situation.
Mm-hmm. We've got the DRC and Rwanda now both calling for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire. On a practical level, is this possible?
It's very difficult to determine if it's going to be really possible, because even when we look into the communique coming out of the both presidency, we realize that from the DRC part, of course, they put emphasis on the unconditional ceasefire. But when you look at the Rwandan's presidency communique, they don't talk about ceasefire. They talk about the needs to address the M23 grievances, the needs to address the FDLR. So we have the feeling that both parties, although they've talked, although they've met, but somehow they do have a different interpretation to what needs to come about. So just because of that, I'm quite skeptical with the hope to see the ceasefire taking ground, because especially right now, the M23 is still moving further and is maybe about to get to Walikale Center, which is another town in the eastern part of the DRC.
Christian-Geraud Neema from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.